The water off Negril is impossibly blue. From above, 7 Mile Beach looks like a postcard brought to life. White sand stretching endlessly, palm trees swaying lazily in the Caribbean breeze, sunlight dancing across the surface of the sea. This is the Jamaica sold to the world. A place of escape. A place where worries dissolve into warm salt air. But on May 27, 2000, paradise became a void. A 29-year-old woman vanished here without a scream, without a struggle, without leaving behind even the smallest clue of where she went, or why she never came back. Her name was Claudia Kirschhoch, and the cruel irony is impossible to ignore. Claudia made her living helping others navigate the world safely. She was an assistant editor for Frommer's Travel Guides, a rising star in the travel journalism world. Her job was to explore destinations, to document them, to warn travelers where to go and where not to. Yet on this island, in broad daylight, inside one of the most famous resort chains in the Caribbean, Claudia Kirschhoch disappeared into thin air. No ransom note. No confirmed witnesses, no body, just a silent hotel room, and questions that still echo more than 2 decades later. Negril, Jamaica, is a place designed to feel timeless. At the turn of the millennium, it was booming. Tourism was the island's lifeblood, and luxury resorts like Sandals and beaches promised absolute safety, controlled environments where guests were shielded from danger, insulated from the realities beyond the gates. Visitors were meant to forget the outside world here. But Claudia's story would ensure the world would never forget Negril, because Claudia was never supposed to be there. Weeks earlier, her assignment had been simple. She was scheduled to join a press trip to Cuba, part of a professional tour meant to gather material for upcoming travel guides. It was routine, carefully planned, approved. Then, at the last minute, everything unraveled. Visa complications, regulatory issues between the United States and Cuba forced a sudden change. The trip was rerouted. The destination was switched. Jamaica, what should have been a seamless transition, became something else entirely. Members of the group were shuffled, plans altered, itineraries rewritten. And somehow, through a bureaucratic twist of fate, Claudia found herself separated from her colleagues. Stranded. Alone. Still working. Still professional. Still unaware that this detour, this accidental change in geography, would become the defining moment of her life. Or its end. Claudia arrived at the beach's Negril Resort, a sister property of the Sandals chain, a place marketed as secure, idyllic, and worry-free. For a travel editor, it was familiar territory. Resorts like this were reviewed, evaluated, dissected for a living. To Claudia, this wasn't danger. It was homework. Friends later described her as ambitious, thoughtful, and deeply committed to her career. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't naive. She was a Brooklyn native, sharp and independent, someone who understood cities, crowds, and risk, which makes what happened next all the more unsettling. On the afternoon of May 27, 2000, Claudia was last seen walking along 7 Mile Beach. The sun was high. The beach was active. Tourists lounged beneath umbrellas. Staff moved back and forth between the resort and the shoreline. Music drifted through the air, blending with the rhythmic crash of waves. Claudia was dressed simply. A bikini, a t-shirt, a portable radio tucked under her arm. No bag, no passport, no money beyond what she already carried. Nothing about the scene suggested danger. And yet, that walk would be the last confirmed moment of her life. She never returned. Hours passed, then more. At first, her absence didn't raise alarms. Resort guests often wandered. Time slipped easily in a place like Negril. But when Claudia failed to appear for her scheduled departure, when she missed her flight, the unease hardened into fear. Staff checked her room. What they found was not chaos. It was silence. The bed was perfectly made. Her passport lay untouched. Her return plane ticket, still there. Her credit cards, and used. Her camera, never recovered from the images she might have taken that day. and $180 in cash, left behind as if she had every intention of coming back. For investigators, this detail would become haunting. People who plan to disappear don't leave their lives neatly folded on a hotel desk. People who walk away don't abandon the very documents required to exist beyond the resort gates. Whatever happened to Claudia Kirschhoch, it was not planned by her. As the sun set over Negril that night, the beach transformed. The laughter faded. The music softened. Darkness crept in, unnoticed. And somewhere between the water and the palm trees, between safety and vulnerability, a line had been crossed. A line no one saw. A line no one could retrace. In the days that followed, questions would pile up faster than answers. Why was she alone? Who was the last person to speak to her? How could someone vanish from a luxury resort without being seen? And most chilling of all, what if paradise itself had been watching and said nothing? In the next chapter, the story will rewind. Back to Claudia's final days at the resort, the people she met, and the man whose name would forever be tied to her disappearance. Because sometimes, the most dangerous place to be is exactly where you were never meant to go. To understand how Claudia Kirschhoch disappeared, you first have to understand who she was before Jamaica ever entered the picture. Because nothing about her life suggested recklessness. Nothing suggested she would simply vanish. Claudia Kirschhoch was 29 years old. She lived in Brooklyn, New York, and she was exactly where she had worked to be. As an assistant editor for Frommer's travel guides, she was building a reputation in a competitive industry, one that demanded intelligence, organization, and an instinct for detail. Colleagues described her as diligent and curious. She wasn't the kind of journalist who skimmed the surface. She wanted to understand places, how they worked, how safe they were, what travelers needed to know before they ever packed a bag. Travel wasn't an escape for Claudia. It was a responsibility, which makes the randomness of what happened to her all the more disturbing. The trip that would change everything was never supposed to involve Jamaica at all. In the spring of 2000, Claudia was assigned to cover Cuba as part of a press tour. It was a coveted opportunity, politically complicated, tightly regulated, and professionally valuable. The itinerary had been approved, flights booked, schedules coordinated. Then, almost at the last minute, the trip collapsed. Visa issues, regulatory barriers, the kind of geopolitical complications that have nothing to do with the people caught in the middle of them. The solution, hastily arranged, reroute the press group to Jamaica instead. On paper, it seemed simple. In reality, it was chaos. Flights were rebooked. Hotel reservations scrambled. Group cohesion fractured. Some members of the press tour arrived earlier. Some later. Some stayed together. Claudia didn't. By the time she reached Jamaica, the group she was supposed to be traveling with was already gone, or about to leave. Schedules no longer aligned. Plans overlapped and then evaporated. She was stranded, not abandoned, exactly, but left alone in a foreign country, working independently, finishing an assignment that had already gone off the rails. For many people, that might have triggered panic. For Claudia, it was just another problem to manage. She checked into the beach's Negril Resort, a property owned by the Sandals chain. To the outside world, it represented safety, structure, control. Guests were encouraged to believe that nothing truly bad could happen within its boundaries, especially not in daylight, especially not to a professional travel writer. Claudia phoned home. She spoke to her parents during this time, reassuring them. She told them about the mix-up, about being rerouted, about Jamaica. There was no hint of fear in her voice, no suggestion that she felt threatened or uneasy. She didn't say she wanted to leave early. She didn't say she felt unsafe. She didn't say she was being followed. If anything, she treated the situation the way she treated most things, with calm pragmatism. She would do her job. She would finish the assignment. She would come home. That was the plan. But plans rely on assumptions. And one of the most dangerous assumptions is believing that controlled environments are truly controlled. At Beach's Negril, Claudia interacted with staff members, other guests, and resort employees whose job was to be friendly, approachable, and visible when necessary. In places like this, boundaries blur easily. Tourists let their guard down. Staff learn who is alone, who is vulnerable, who doesn't have anyone else watching out for them. Claudia was polite, observant, professional. She also stood out. She was alone. She wasn't part of a couple. She wasn't moving with a group. And in a place built on appearances, that mattered. Somewhere during her stay, Claudia met Anthony Grant. He worked as a bartender at the resort. By all outward accounts, their interaction was unremarkable. He was friendly. She was friendly. Conversations happened the way they often do between guests and staff. Small talk, casual exchanges, nothing that would immediately raise concern. At least, not at first. No one reported arguments. No one reported tension. No one reported anything that would later explain how Claudia could simply disappear. But as investigators would eventually learn, not all interactions leave witnesses, and not all dangers announce themselves. By the morning of May 27th, Claudia's time in Jamaica was nearly over. She had a flight scheduled. She had packed nothing to suggest she was leaving early or staying longer. Her room remained orderly, untouched by panic or haste. That afternoon, she stepped on a 7-mile beach. The sun was unforgiving. The air was thick. The water shimmered endlessly. It was the kind of day people remember for how beautiful it was. It would also become the last day anyone could say, with certainty, that Claudia Kirschhoch was alive. In the next part, we will reconstruct her final days and final moments. The subtle interactions, the overlooked details, and the last sighting that would become the cornerstone of a mystery no one has been able to solve. Because sometimes, the moment everything changes, looks exactly like any other day. In places like Negril, time behaves differently. Days melt into one another beneath the sun. Schedules soften. People lose track of hours, lulled into a sense that nothing truly urgent can exist where the ocean is always within reach. For Claudia Kirschhoch, those final days unfolded inside this illusion. By late May of 2000, she had settled into a quiet routine at the beach's Negril Resort. Without her press group, she moved independently, observing, taking notes, absorbing the atmosphere the way a travel editor is trained to do. She ate alone. She walked alone. She listened more than she spoke. To other guests, she was just another traveler enjoying paradise. To staff, she was familiar enough to recognize, but not close enough for anyone to truly know her movements. And that anonymity would matter. Claudia spent time around the resort's bars and common areas, places designed for easy conversation. Bartenders, servers, and activity coordinators moved constantly, trained to be engaging but unobtrusive. It was in one of these spaces that she interacted more frequently with Anthony Grant. Grant worked behind the bar. He was described as personable, helpful, and attentive, exactly what was expected of someone in his role. Guests trusted him. Management trusted him. He had access to the rhythms of resort life, to the unspoken knowledge of who came and went. Claudia and Grant talked about where she was from, about her work, about travel. Nothing about their conversations was reported as alarming. No one overheard arguments. No one recalled raised voices or discomfort. But absence of alarm is not absence of danger, especially in environments where friendliness is mandatory. Claudia was seen walking the grounds during the day, sometimes with a notebook, sometimes simply observing. She wasn't drinking heavily. She wasn't partying. She wasn't behaving in a way that suggested she'd abandon her responsibilities. She had a flight to catch. She had work to turn in. She had a life waiting for her in New York. Those who later tried to reconstruct her mindset found nothing that pointed to escape or self-destruction. Everything pointed forward. On the afternoon of May 27th, the heat settled over 7 Mile Beach like a weight. This stretch of coastline is long, open, and deceptively exposed. Despite the resorts lining it, the beach itself is public. Vendors pass through. Locals walk freely. Guests drift in and out of the water. Security exists, but it is diffuse. That afternoon, Claudia was seen walking along the sand. She wore a bikini and a t-shirt, dressed like countless others around her. Under her arm, she carried a portable radio, a small detail that would later feel strangely intimate. Music accompanying her steps, her thoughts turned inward. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't meeting anyone, at least, not that anyone could confirm. She appeared calm. This is the last confirmed sighting of Claudia Kirschhoch. After this moment, her movements disappear into silence. No one reported seeing her enter the water. No one reported a struggle. No screams carried over the surf. No disturbance broke the rhythm of the beach. It was as if she had stepped out of the frame of reality. As the afternoon gave way to evening, people returned to their rooms. The beach thinned. Shadows stretched across the sand. Claudia did not come back. When night fell, nothing seemed immediately wrong. Resort life continued. Guests dined. Music played. Staff cleaned and prepared for another day. But somewhere in that seamless transition from daylight to darkness, a woman vanished. And no one noticed. Not yet. It wasn't until the following day, when Claudia failed to appear for her scheduled departure, that concern began to take shape. Calls went unanswered. Her room remained locked. Her name stayed uncalled at the airport. What initially felt like a delay slowly transformed into dread. Staff opened her door, and what they found would chill everyone involved. In the next chapter, we enter the silent room, a place frozen in time, filled with evidence not of escape, but of interruption. Because whatever happened to Claudia Kirschhoch happened before she had a chance to leave. There are few things more unsettling than a place that feels abandoned, yet untouched. When resort staff finally opened the door to Claudia Kirschhoch's room, they weren't prepared for what they would see. There was no chaos, no overturned furniture, no signs of panic. The room was pristine. The bed was neatly made, the sheets smooth, as if no one had slept in them. Her clothes were folded, her belongings arranged the way someone leaves them when they expect to return. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating a space frozen in time. It felt wrong, because people don't vanish from orderly rooms. Investigators would later describe the scene as one of the most important and most chilling elements of the case. On the desk lay Claudia's passport. Next to it, her return plane ticket, the same flight she had failed to board. Her credit cards were untouched. Her camera remained behind, and $180 in cash sat where she had left it. Nothing was missing. Nothing suggested she had packed in a hurry or made plans to leave on her own. There were no notes, no messages, no indication of distress. This wasn't the room of someone who decided to disappear. This was the room of someone who fully intended to come back. For seasoned investigators, the implications were immediate. A person cannot travel internationally without a passport. A person planning a new life does not abandon money. A person leaving voluntarily does not leave behind the tools of their work. Theories of running away collapsed almost instantly. Whatever happened to Claudia occurred outside this room, and it happened suddenly. As news of her disappearance spread, a sense of urgency finally took hold. Local police were notified. Resort security began internal reviews. Word reached the United States, triggering involvement from American authorities. The FBI would eventually become involved, but their power was limited. This was Jamaica's jurisdiction. They could advise, observe, and assist, but they could not take control. From the beginning, the investigation was fragmented. Time passed, and in missing person cases, time is everything. Claudia's parents were informed. The call they received would change their lives forever. Their daughter, organized, responsible, meticulous, had vanished in a foreign country. The place that had promised safety now offered only silence. They immediately began pushing for answers. How could this happen? Who had last seen her? Why wasn't security tighter? But as days went by, the answers came slowly or not at all. The resort maintained that they had no knowledge of what had happened. Staff interviews yielded little. Guests had come and gone. Memories blurred. 7 Mile Beach, so beautiful and open, was also expansive and difficult to monitor. Anyone could have walked past Claudia. Anyone could have spoken to her, or taken her. Then came the first major shift in the case. Investigators brought in search dogs. It was a last hope, a way to let instinct and scent do what witnesses could not. A piece of Claudia's clothing was used. The dogs were taken to the beach. At first, nothing. Then suddenly, the dog reacted. It picked up her scent, and it began to move. Away from the shoreline. Away from the water. Not toward the ocean where an accidental drowning might have occurred, but inland, toward the resort grounds. This was the moment the case changed. Because the dog wasn't searching for a lost traveler anymore. It was following a trail. In the next part, we will follow that trail, step by step, as it leads investigators somewhere no one expected, and to a man whose name would become impossible to separate from Claudia Kirschhoch's fate. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't scream. It waits, until someone finally listens. The moment the search dog caught Claudia Kirschhoch's scent, the investigation took a darker, far more disturbing turn. This was no longer a missing person case defined by uncertainty and hope. This was a trail, and it was leading somewhere very specific. The dog moved with purpose, nose low to the ground, weaving through the resort's pathways. Investigators followed closely, aware that every step mattered. The scent did not return to Claudia's hotel room. It did not fade near the shoreline. Instead, it traveled away from the public areas of 7 Mile Beach, past palm trees, past resort structures, past the places guests were meant to stay. Then the dog stopped. At a car. More specifically, at the back seat. Then the trunk. The vehicle belonged to Anthony Grant, the bartender. For investigators, this was a critical moment. Search dogs are not infallible, but their reliability in tracking human scent, especially over short time frames, is well documented. The dog had not hesitated. It had not wandered. It had gone directly from the beach to Grant's car. And it wasn't finished. From the car, the dog continued. The scent trail led away from the resort into the local community, to Anthony Grant's home. There, once again, the dog reacted. The implication was impossible to ignore. Claudia Kirschhoch had been in Grant's car, and her scent had been transferred to his residence. In any well-controlled investigation, this would have triggered immediate escalation. Instead, it triggered confusion. Police searched Grant's vehicle and home. What they found raised even more questions. Boots, gloves, and a knife. Objects that could be ordinary. Objects that could also be something else entirely. But here is where the case begins to fracture. Evidence handling was sloppy. Procedures were not followed consistently. Items were not preserved the way they should have been. Documentation was incomplete. Timelines blurred. Some evidence was allegedly contaminated. Some was never properly tested. Some simply vanished into bureaucratic uncertainty. And despite the scent evidence, despite the troubling findings, Anthony Grant was never charged. Not with murder, not with kidnapping, not with any crime related to Claudia's disappearance. Grant denied involvement. He admitted knowing Claudia, admitted speaking with her, admitted that she had been around the bar, but he claimed he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Without a body, without forensic proof, without a confession, the case stalled. For Claudia's parents, this was unbearable. They had believed that once the search dog led investigators to a suspect, the nightmare might end, that answers, if not justice, would finally come. Instead, they watched as the investigation lost momentum. They watched as leads went cold, and they began to sense something far more disturbing than incompetence. Tourism is Jamaica's economic lifeline. Resorts like Sandals and beaches are not just businesses, they are pillars of the national image. A violent crime involving a foreign tourist, especially one that occurs inside or near a luxury resort, is more than a tragedy. It's a threat to reputation, to revenue, to the image of paradise. and Claudia's parents would come to believe that protecting that image mattered more than finding their daughter. The FBI remained involved, but only in a limited advisory role. They could not arrest. They could not seize evidence. They could not force action. They could only watch. And as weeks turned into months, the case slipped further into uncertainty. No body surfaced. No witnesses came forward. No charges were filed. Just a name, a trail, and a silence that felt deliberate. In the next chapter, we will examine the growing controversy surrounding the investigation, the allegations of negligence, the mounting frustration of Claudia's family, and the question that refuses to go away. Was this a tragic failure of justice? Or something far worse? Because when evidence points in one direction and nothing happens, you have to ask why. And who benefits from that silence? As days stretched into weeks, something unsettling became impossible to ignore. The investigation into Claudia Kirschhoch's disappearance wasn't intensifying. It was fading. In most missing person cases, especially those involving foreign nationals, pressure builds. Leads are chased. Evidence is scrutinized. Suspects are monitored. Here, the opposite seemed to happen. Momentum stalled. Claudia's parents, desperate and unwilling to accept silence as an answer, flew to Jamaica. They walked the same beach their daughter had last been seen on. They stood inside the resort that had promised safety. And what they encountered was not reassurance. It was resistance. Questions were met with vague responses. Requests for information were delayed. Meetings were postponed. The sense they had, that something was being quietly minimized, only grew stronger. They weren't treated like parents searching for a missing child. They were treated like an inconvenience. From the family's perspective, the warning signs were everywhere. Why wasn't the scent trail pursued more aggressively? Why wasn't Anthony Grant held for further questioning? Why were items found in his possession not subjected to rigorous forensic testing? Each unanswered question deepened their fear that Claudia's case was being buried, not by time, but by choice. Behind the scenes, another reality loomed. Jamaica's economy depended heavily on tourism. Resorts like Beach's Negril were global brands, trusted by travelers from around the world. The idea that a woman could disappear from one of these properties, and that foul play was suspected, posed a serious threat. A scandal like that doesn't just damage one resort. It damages an entire industry. And industries have ways of protecting themselves. Local authorities maintained that they had done what they could, that there was no definitive proof of a crime, that without a body, the case remained speculative. But for Claudia's parents, this reasoning felt hollow. The evidence hadn't been exhausted. It had been mishandled. Even the role of the FBI underscored the imbalance. Agents could advise Jamaican police. They could share expertise. But they could not control the investigation. They could not force arrests. They could not compel action when local authorities chose to step back. International borders had turned justice into a negotiation. And Claudia was caught in the middle. As time passed, witnesses' memories dulled. Staff members moved on. Guests returned home. The resort continued operating as if nothing had happened. 7 Mile Beach filled with new footprints every day, erasing whatever trace of Claudia might have remained. Her story began slipping from headlines. But her parents refused to let it disappear. With criminal avenues closing, they turned to the only option left to them, the courts. If no one would be held criminally responsible, then perhaps someone could be held accountable. They began preparing a civil lawsuit against the Sandals/Beaches resort chain, alleging negligence, arguing that the resort failed to provide adequate security, failed to respond appropriately, and failed to protect a guest who was clearly alone and vulnerable. It wasn't about money. It was about forcing answers into the open. This legal battle would drag Claudia's disappearance back into the spotlight and expose uncomfortable truths about how far powerful institutions might go to protect their image. In the next chapter, we will dive into that fight, the courtroom struggles, the sealed documents, and the allegations that suggested Claudia's disappearance was not just a mystery, but a scandal waiting to be uncovered. Because sometimes, when justice fails in the streets, it has to be chased in court. When the criminal investigation stalled, Claudia Kirschhoch's parents made a decision no family should ever have to make. They would take on a global resort empire, not because they believed a lawsuit could bring their daughter back, but because it was the only remaining way to force the truth into daylight. The civil suit filed against the Sandals/Beaches resort chain alleged something deeply troubling: that Claudia's disappearance was not just the result of a crime, but the result of systemic negligence. The argument was straightforward. Claudia was a registered guest. She was alone. She disappeared from resort property or directly adjacent to it. And yet, security measures were inadequate. Surveillance was limited. Staff training was inconsistent. Records of staff movements and guest interactions were incomplete or non-existent. In a place marketed as safe paradise, these gaps mattered. As the lawsuit progressed, uncomfortable details began to surface. Security patrols were not continuous along 7 Mile Beach. There was no comprehensive camera coverage. Logs documenting staff whereabouts were unreliable. In other words, the resort could not definitively say who was where when Claudia vanished. That absence of information was not accidental. It was structural. For the Kirschhoch family, this was devastating. If the resort could not track its own employees or guarantee guest safety, how many other incidents had gone unnoticed? How many close calls had never become cases because the outcome wasn't fatal or didn't involve a missing body? The lawsuit forced these questions into public record, and the response was swift. The resort chain denied all wrongdoing. They argued that Claudia left the property voluntarily, that 7 Mile Beach was a public area beyond their control, that there was no proof she was harmed on resort grounds. Legally, these defenses were powerful. Morally, they felt hollow. As the case dragged on, pressure mounted behind closed doors. Documents were contested. Depositions were limited. Key details were disputed or sealed. The family fought for access to security logs, employee records, and internal communications. Not all of it was granted, and every denied request felt like another door quietly closing. Meanwhile, public attention faded. Without a criminal trial, there were no dramatic court appearances, no verdicts, no sentencing. The story slipped into the category of unsolved mysteries, the place where cases go when they are too inconvenient to finish. But for Claudia's parents, the mystery was never abstract. It was personal. Every unanswered question was a wound that never healed. Anthony Grant remained a shadow over the case. Despite the scent evidence, despite the items found in his possession, he lived freely. He was never charged, never tried. To the legal system, he remained a man of interest. To the family, he remained the last clear lead. And that gap, between suspicion and accountability, was where the case seemed permanently stuck. In time, the lawsuit would be settled, not with admissions of guilt, not with explanations, but with silence. Agreements that closed doors instead of opening them. For the outside world, it marked the end of Claudia Kirschhoch's story. But for those who cared about the truth, it marked the beginning of something far more troubling. In the next chapter, we will examine the theories, the possibilities investigators couldn't prove, the scenarios that fit the evidence, and the questions that still refuse to be answered. Because when facts run out, patterns begin to speak. When a case ends without answers, the silence fills itself. Investigators stop speaking. Officials move on. Paperwork is archived and forgotten. But the human mind doesn't accept a vacuum, especially when the evidence points in one direction and justice never follows. In the disappearance of Claudia Kirschhoch, theories didn't emerge from imagination. They emerged from what remained. The first and most haunting theory is the simplest one: a crime of opportunity. Claudia was alone in a foreign country. She was separated from her group. She had no one expecting her back at a specific hour. She walked a public beach where boundaries between guests, staff, and locals blurred easily. She trusted the environment. Someone else may have recognized that vulnerability. This theory aligns with what little is known. A brief interaction, a moment of trust, an invitation, a ride offered casually in the heat of the afternoon. No force, no witnesses, no alarm. Just one decision that could never be undone. The second theory centers on familiarity. Crimes are often committed not by strangers in shadows, but by people who have already crossed the victim's path. Anthony Grant had spoken to Claudia. He knew her routine. He knew she was alone. He knew when she was scheduled to leave. And the scent trail, the most compelling physical evidence in the case, placed Claudia in his car and at his home. Supporters of this theory argue that it wasn't premeditated. It was impulsive, a moment that escalated beyond control. Another theory, more disturbing, suggests systemic failure rather than individual guilt. That Claudia encountered danger not because of one person, but because of a chain of negligence. Poor lighting, inadequate security, lack of surveillance. In this scenario, the crime could have involved someone never identified, or someone whose involvement was obscured by sloppy evidence handling and institutional reluctance to dig too deeply. The truth may have slipped away not because it was hidden, but because no one held on tightly enough. Then there is the theory few want to voice aloud. A cover-up, not an orchestrated conspiracy, but a quiet, incremental burying of a problem. Delays, missed opportunities, evidence mishandled not by accident, but by indifference. Each small failure justified as unavoidable. Each unanswered question framed as unfortunate. Together, they create something powerful. Plausible deniability. In this theory, Claudia's disappearance wasn't solved not because it couldn't be, but because solving it would have been inconvenient. What none of the theories can explain is the absence of a body. The ocean never gave her back. The land never revealed her remains. No accidental drowning was confirmed. No forensic trace emerged to close the case. Her disappearance defied geography. It left investigators with a story that refused to end cleanly. For Claudia's parents, theory didn't bring comfort. They wanted proof. They wanted accountability. They wanted someone to say, definitively, what happened to their daughter. Instead, they were left with fragments. And fragments don't heal. Over time, Claudia Kirschhoch's case became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even in places designed to feel safe, even under the bright sun of paradise, darkness can move unseen. In the next chapter, we will explore the lasting impact of her disappearance, how it changed resort security practices, how it reshaped her family's lives, and why her story still matters today. Because some mysteries don't fade. They wait, and they ask us whether we are willing to remember or willing to look away. Long after the headlines faded, the disappearance of Claudia Kirschhoch continued to ripple outward, quietly, invisibly, but relentlessly. Cases like this don't end. They fracture lives. For Claudia's parents, time did not soften the loss. It sharpened it. Every year that passed without answers deepened the absence. Holidays arrived with an empty chair. Birthdays became reminders of a future that never unfolded. Their daughter did not become a memory. They were forced to live with a question. What haunts families of the missing most is not death. It is uncertainty. No grave to visit. No final moment to mourn. No certainty that suffering ended. Just the endless possibility that somewhere, somehow, the truth still exists, just out of reach. The Kirschhochs became reluctant advocates. They spoke to journalists. They revisited painful details. They allowed their private grief to become public in the hope that someone, somewhere, might come forward. A staff member, a guest, a local resident, anyone with one missing piece of the puzzle. But silence persisted. Behind the scenes, the travel industry watched closely. Claudia's disappearance unsettled a narrative the tourism world depends on, that controlled luxury environments eliminate risk. In the years following her case, resorts across the Caribbean quietly adjusted. Security patrols became more visible. Surveillance coverage expanded. Policies around solo travelers were revisited. No official statement ever linked these changes to Claudia, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Her case also became a reference point in discussions about jurisdictional limits. When crimes occur abroad, especially in tourist regions, foreign families face a harsh reality. Justice is constrained by borders. The FBI cannot take over. U.S. courts have limited reach. Local authorities decide how far a case goes. And sometimes, that distance is enough to let answers disappear. For true crime researchers, Claudia's story occupies a unique space. It isn't defined by shocking violence or graphic detail. It's defined by absence. An empty room, a scent trail without an ending, a suspect without charges. It forces a question that lingers uncomfortably. If this could happen to a travel professional at a luxury resort, who is truly safe? Over time, online forums and investigative journalists revisited the case. Each retelling brought renewed attention, but no new evidence. The facts never changed. And that, in itself, became part of the tragedy. Yet Claudia's story did leave something behind. It reminded travelers to remain vigilant, even in paradise. It reminded families to ask hard questions when answers come too easily. And it reminded institutions that silence does not erase responsibility. In the next chapter, we will return to the man at the center of suspicion, the figure who remains legally untouched but forever linked to Claudia's fate. Who was Anthony Grant? And how does a person live under the shadow of an unsolved disappearance? Because sometimes, the most revealing stories are not about what happened, but about what didn't. In every unsolved case, there is a figure who exists in a kind of permanent twilight, not proven guilty, not cleared, not forgotten. In the disappearance of Claudia Kirschhoch, that figure is Anthony Grant. Grant was not a stranger pulled from the margins of the investigation. He was part of Claudia's daily environment. As a bartender at the beach's Negril resort, he occupied a position of trust. Guests saw him as friendly, familiar, safe. Management saw him as an employee doing his job, and Claudia saw him as someone she could talk to. That is what makes his presence in the case so unsettling. Investigators confirmed that Grant had interacted with Claudia multiple times. He knew she was alone. He knew her departure date. He knew her routine well enough to recognize when something was out of the ordinary. Then came the scent trail. From the beach, to his car, to his home. No amount of explanation could erase that sequence. Yet legally, it wasn't enough. Grant denied harming Claudia. He offered no confession, no slip of the tongue, no version of events that could be definitively disproven. Without forensic evidence tying him to a crime scene, without a body, the case remained circumstantial. In court, circumstantial evidence can be powerful. In this case, it was fragile. What remains difficult to reconcile is what didn't happen. Grant was not arrested. He was not charged. He was not tried. His life continued, largely out of public view. For the Kirschhoch family, this was unbearable. To know that the person most closely associated with their daughter's final known movements remained free, while Claudia herself remained missing, felt like a second injustice layered onto the first. Some investigators have quietly acknowledged that had the evidence been handled differently, the outcome might have changed. Better documentation, faster action, stricter procedures. Any one of these might have turned suspicion into proof. But justice does not operate on might have. It operates on what survives scrutiny. And much of the evidence in Claudia's case did not survive intact. There is also the human cost for Grant himself, an uncomfortable truth rarely discussed. To live under suspicion, year after year, without resolution, is its own kind of prison. Yet unlike Claudia, he had a life to continue. That imbalance remains at the heart of the story. Grant's silence has endured. He has not publicly revisited the case. He has not offered explanations beyond his initial statements. Whether this is guilt, fear, or the advice of legal counsel is impossible to know. What is certain is that his name remains inseparable from Claudia's disappearance. A connection cemented not by verdict, but by unanswered questions. In the next chapter, we will step back and examine the broader picture. How Claudia Kirschhoch's case fits into a troubling pattern of disappearances, tourism-related crimes, and the challenges of justice in paradise. Because Claudia's story is not unique. It is simply one of the few we still remember. And memory, in cases like this, may be the last form of accountability left. Jamaica has long been marketed as a dreamscape. The kind of place where turquoise waters meet endless white sand, where the sun is constant, and where worries are meant to melt into the background. But paradise has shadows. For every postcard-perfect image of 7 Mile Beach, there is another story the brochures don't tell. A local who disappears into the night. A tourist who missteps. A crime that is quietly handled, minimized, or left unsolved. These shadows exist because the very architecture of paradise depends on appearances. Luxury resorts are meant to feel controlled, safe, and indulgent. They are curated experiences where danger is largely theoretical, until it isn't. Claudia Kirschhoch's disappearance revealed that illusion in stark relief. Investigators repeatedly pointed to vulnerabilities in resort security that, before this case, had gone largely unquestioned. Beach patrols were limited. Cameras did not cover every stretch of sand. Staff were encouraged to maintain hospitality first, vigilance second. And while these policies may have been convenient for management, they left gaps. A solitary traveler could move with little scrutiny. In Claudia's case, those gaps were fatal. For families and journalists alike, the case also exposed the tension between tourism and justice. Economic interests are powerful. A violent crime involving a foreign guest is not just a tragedy. It is a potential headline that could ripple worldwide, threatening bookings, reputations, and the livelihoods of countless employees. And somewhere in the background of every press release, every delayed response, every mishandled piece of evidence, one question lingers. Was the pursuit of truth quietly weighed against the cost to an industry? Travel writers like Claudia often walked this line unconsciously. Their work required immersion into the local environment, trust in the people around them, and a willingness to navigate both natural and human risks. Claudia had done this countless times. Yet for the first time, a seemingly ordinary trip became an extraordinary danger. She was no thrill seeker. She was careful, competent, professional, and that made her disappearance all the more haunting. Over the years, Claudia's story became a reference point for other investigations, particularly in the Caribbean. Security protocols at resorts were quietly revised. Employee training included new emphasis on guest accountability. Surveillance coverage expanded. Emergency procedures were reevaluated. But the lessons were learned after the fact, and only because her disappearance could not be ignored. For the public, the case became a dark cautionary tale. Even in paradise, vigilance matters. Even in a controlled environment, accidents or crimes can happen. And even when evidence points clearly in one direction, accountability is never guaranteed. Claudia's disappearance is a stark reminder. Beauty and danger can exist side by side, and sometimes the brightest sun casts the darkest shadow. In the next chapter, we will examine the investigative dead ends, the missteps, the lost evidence, and the ways in which bureaucratic failures allowed the mystery to grow deeper, leaving only questions where answers should have been. Because sometimes the most haunting stories are not the ones you see, but the ones deliberately left unseen. For investigators, Claudia Kirschhoch's disappearance became a study in frustration. Every lead seemed promising at first, then dissipated. Every clue suggested a path, then twisted into uncertainty. And the trail was littered with what should never happen in a serious criminal investigation: missteps, mishandling, and lost opportunities. The scent trail identified by the search dogs was the first major breakthrough. From 7 Mile Beach to Anthony Grant's car, and then to his home, the evidence was tangible, specific, and highly suggestive. Yet despite this clear direction, the investigation faltered. Items found, boots, gloves, a knife, were not preserved properly. Forensic testing was incomplete or inconclusive. Critical timelines were poorly documented. Evidence was contaminated or disappeared entirely. Investigators, both local and international, would later describe the situation as a perfect storm of procedural failure. Interviews with resort staff were inconsistent. Some employees claimed not to remember important interactions. Others provided contradictory statements. Requests for surveillance records were met with delays. Logs were incomplete. Guest accounts were dismissed as unreliable. Each dead end compounded the mystery, making it impossible to form a coherent sequence of events. Even the role of the FBI was constrained. Agents could advise and observe. They could help organize searches and recommend forensic procedures. But they had no authority to seize evidence or compel local authorities to act. In a case where every hour mattered, that limitation proved critical. The resort's internal response added another layer of frustration. Management emphasized that Claudia's disappearance occurred in a public area. They highlighted that she was a guest in a sprawling resort, where monitoring every corner was impossible. They claimed compliance with local law enforcement instructions. To outsiders, these arguments appeared defensive, and for Claudia's parents, they appeared evasive. Perhaps the most devastating dead end was the absence of a body. Without it, investigators could not prove murder. Without proof of a crime, charges could not be filed. Suspicions, no matter how compelling, could not become convictions. Anthony Grant remained free. The trail went cold, and the world was left with a beautiful hotel, a public beach, and a single unresolved question. Where did Claudia Kirschhoch go? This pattern of procedural failures and mismanaged evidence fueled the next stage of the story, the public and legal push to expose negligence and demand accountability. Because when investigators reach dead ends, families and journalists often become the last line of pursuit. In the next chapter, we will explore the public fight, the court battles, and the family's desperate attempt to force transparency. A battle that revealed just how far institutions would go to protect their image and how little they were willing to prioritize a missing young woman. When investigative avenues failed, Claudia Kirschhoch's parents took their fight to the courtroom. It was a battle few families ever have to wage, and one they never wanted to face. The civil lawsuit against the Sandals/Beaches resort chain alleged gross negligence. The arguments were straightforward but powerful. Claudia was a registered guest, staying on resort property. She disappeared under circumstances that suggested foul play. Security measures were inadequate, particularly for a solo traveler. Critical evidence was mishandled or overlooked by authorities. The resort had a duty of care to ensure the safety of its guests, a duty it had failed to uphold. The lawsuit was never about financial compensation. It was about forcing transparency, demanding answers, and creating a public record of what had gone wrong. In court, the resort mounted a vigorous defense. They argued, 7 Mile Beach is public property. Their control ends where public access begins. There was no conclusive evidence that a crime occurred on resort property. The disappearance was a tragic but unforeseeable event. It was a classic clash, a grieving family demanding accountability versus a powerful corporation protecting its reputation. Depositions revealed more troubling details. Staff schedules were inconsistent. Logs of security patrols were incomplete. Requests for internal communications were blocked or heavily redacted. Every answer revealed more gaps. Every document left more questions unanswered. The lawsuit cast a harsh light on the uncomfortable truth. When money and image are at stake, institutions can move to minimize risk rather than pursue justice. The legal battle dragged on for years, a slow and grinding process that kept Claudia's story in the public eye but offered no closure. The resort eventually reached a settlement, the terms of which were largely confidential. There was no public acknowledgement of responsibility. There was no disclosure of evidence that might have led to a resolution. For the Kirschhoch family, the courtroom did not deliver justice. It delivered partial truth. Even today, the case remains unresolved. Anthony Grant was never charged. No body has been recovered. Critical evidence was mishandled or disappeared. And the world is left with only fragments, a tidy hotel room, a trail that led nowhere, and questions that refuse to fade. Claudia's disappearance is not just a story about one young woman vanishing in paradise. It is a story about the fragility of trust, about how institutions respond when confronted with inconvenient truths, about how a single life can be swallowed up in a system more concerned with image than accountability. In the next chapter, we will examine the lasting legacy of Claudia Kirschhoch, how her story continues to resonate, what lessons it left for travelers and investigators alike, and why it refuses to be forgotten. Because some disappearances are not just tragedies, they are warnings. Claudia Kirschhoch's story did not end with the settlement, or with unanswered questions, or with a trail that went cold. Her disappearance left a lasting impact on her family, on travel safety, and on the way we think about the places we visit. For her parents, the fight never truly ended. Every year that passed without answers deepened the wound. They continued to speak publicly about their daughter, keeping her story alive in news articles, forums, and documentaries. They reminded the world that behind every missing person headline, there is a life abruptly interrupted and a family left in limbo. Their persistence ensured that Claudia's name did not fade into obscurity. In the travel industry, the case prompted reflection and subtle change. Resorts began reviewing guest safety policies. Surveillance became more comprehensive. Beach patrols increased. Staff were trained to monitor solo travelers more carefully. None of these measures could bring Claudia back, but they became a testament to the cost of complacency and a reminder that luxury and safety are not synonymous. For the true crime community, Claudia's case occupies a chilling space. It is not defined by graphic violence. It is defined by absence, silence, and unanswered questions. The allure of 7 Mile Beach, the beauty, the sun, the illusion of paradise, contrasts sharply with the darkness that lurked just beneath. That contrast continues to grip those who revisit her story, because it is a warning. Danger can hide in plain sight, even in places designed to feel invulnerable. Anthony Grant remains a central figure in the narrative. Legally, he is untouched. Investigators' suspicions linger, but without proof, the story remains unresolved. His continued freedom emphasizes the frustrating reality of international investigations, procedural failures, and the limits of justice. Claudia's disappearance also reminds us that tragedy can exist in ordinary moments. A walk along the beach, a conversation with a friendly bartender, a sunny afternoon in paradise. These mundane details underscore the unpredictability of danger and the fragility of human life when circumstance collides with vulnerability. Her story is both a mystery and a cautionary tale, a haunting reminder that even in the most beautiful settings, lives can be upended in an instant. As we move to the final chapter, the focus will shift to reflection and unanswered questions, the enduring haunting of a life that vanished, the void left behind, and the hope that someday someone, somewhere, might finally speak what they know. Because in cases like Claudia's, the story is never just about what happened. It is about what is lost, what remains, and what may yet come to light. Claudia Kirschhoch vanished on May 27, 2000. More than 2 decades have passed. Her room remains empty. Her belongings untouched. Her life, a story that stopped abruptly in paradise. And yet, the questions remain. Why did Claudia never return from 7 Mile Beach? Was she taken by someone she knew, or by a stranger who recognized an opportunity? Was her disappearance the result of a single, impulsive act, or a series of oversights and negligence that created the perfect storm for tragedy? Was Anthony Grant involved, or was his connection merely circumstantial, a shadow cast by proximity and mismanaged evidence? Why was critical evidence mishandled? Why were security gaps left unaddressed? Why did bureaucracy, economic concerns, and institutional self-interest seem to outweigh the urgency of finding a missing person? And most haunting of all, where is Claudia? For her parents, these questions have become a lifetime of grief and relentless pursuit. They have fought against indifference, against lost opportunities, against silence. They have sought justice in courts, through the press, and in public memory. Yet the case remains officially unsolved. Claudia's disappearance reminds us of a universal truth. The world can appear safe, even perfect, and yet danger can exist just beyond the surface. 7 Mile Beach, with its turquoise waters and endless sand, is no longer just a vacation destination. In the shadow of her story, it is also a place where vigilance matters, where appearances can be deceiving, and where tragedy can strike quietly, without warning. For investigators, for travelers, for families of the missing, and for anyone who has ever wondered how easily a life can vanish, Claudia Kirschhoch's story endures. It is not a story of resolution. It is a story of absence, a story of mystery, a story of warning, and it is a story that refuses to be forgotten. Somewhere, perhaps, someone knows something. Someone who could finally answer the questions that have haunted 2 decades. Until that moment comes, the world remembers Claudia Kirschhoch, not for the life she lived, but for the life that vanished in paradise. Her disappearance is a shadow over the bright sun of Negril, a reminder that beauty can conceal darkness, and that some stories remain unresolved, waiting for the truth to emerge from the silent sands. The end for now.